I'm very happy to have you three in this panel, and I'm really looking forward for the conversation. So let us maybe start immediately. And this is a question for the panel as a whole. So to start off with, it's been a little bit over 15 years now that the ASEAN Charter was adopted in 2007, November 2007, and which references democracy and human rights as core principles. How would you view the impact of the Charter now today? Would you say that it influenced some of the directions that ASEAN has taken in the past few years? I do realize that there's just one mic, but anyone who wants to start? I will give you the mic first.
Yes, if we look at the democratic index, for instance, by Economic Intelligence Unit or other institution, you can see that now is a very hard time for everyone. Most of the index like going down. Yeah, but I believe that in other regions, they are decreasing faster than in Southeast Asia. So a part of the, if we are talking about population, so in Indonesia, still democracy matters a lot. We are going soon to have a democracy in the region, in Indonesia with like a general election and so on. But we cannot only say that democracy and human rights as one single entity. It must be connected with a culture, the local cultures. And that is the point of Southeast Asia, because it's very rich in culture. Just one example, for instance, in Indonesia, I used to start with like something like, why the national language is Bahasa, not Javanese? Now, 60% of the population or ethnicity is the majority are Javanese. And Bahasa is from the minority at that time, Malay. But then the founding fathers and mothers decide Bahasa from the minority to become one national language. Number two, for instance, we have a lot of 1955 is the triumph of liberal democracy in Indonesia. So our democracy is not only just now, we have an experience before 1955 as multi-party democracy, as messy democracy. And now we also have democracy again after the fall of Suharto. But one point is this, we have many ethnicity, but once in a time, it's always famous in here, relation between the Northern Territory and Makassar Bugis. And how many the population actually on Makassar Bugis to a ratio in Indonesia, less than 50%. But in one time we have Habibie, for instance, a Bugis Makassaris that become our president in the top position. And also Yusuf Kala during the reform era, it became vice president. So we need to think beyond democracy, and with, this can be culture, the underlying culture. In ASEAN, we need to consider that as well, yeah, the underlying culture, because we understand that democracy should go hand in hand with cultures, and democracy should be homegrown. It's not imposed by other civilization. So I still have a lot of hope for democracy in ASEAN. Yeah.
Sure, since I got the microphone here. And again, thanks for the invitation to join this panel. I would just add, as an observer, I guess, to the question of what direction ASEAN has taken since the Charter was adopted. Then back in 2007, I think, it was a radical pivot of change for ASEAN with regards to human rights. It was, you looked across the region and variously it was about rejection, even abuse, sometimes denial or just pure indifference to human rights. So I think with the Charter, it was a pivotal moment. It was a milestone, you could say, in terms of the institution building of ASEAN. And obviously what followed was the Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. You had the Human Rights Declaration a few years later. And today I would say, despite a lot of difficulty and there's still a lot of cases which they're now addressing, I think it formally lauded, human rights and democracy as a central part of what ASEAN is and wants to be. And if you look forward to today, they have the, I guess, the Community Vision 2025, which again speaks to the importance of human rights and democracy. However, reality is quite different, and if you take, a cursory observation of the region, there is a lot of cases of human rights abuse and a lot of difficulty and obviously mismatch, I would say, between the goals of the Charter and its implementation. And I think that was also to some extent expected because the Charter is very ambitious and aspirational. So I think however one wants to look at ASEAN's human rights regime, I think my key point is development and what we see today was it opened a space for discourse, discussion around human rights that you wouldn't have seen before. And even you see today that individual countries are now also speaking up when they see human rights abuse happening within the member states of ASEAN, which is again something that wouldn't have happened, I think, unless that charter was in place. So a few observations from me.
Thank you firstly to the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre for inviting me and to my fellow panellists, and I'd like to also acknowledge that we're on Gadigal country and that sovereignty was never ceded. I think following on from Thomas and Pak Siswa, a key question for me is whether the Charter has helped facilitate an effective response to regional crises. That's what becomes often front of mind in recent times in particular. So does the Charter help those member states who would like to respond with a mechanism with which to respond? And many would look at the situation in Myanmar, which I'm sure we'll talk about today, and say, well, no, not really. On one hand, there could be an argument that it's hard to imagine the 5-point consensus being created without that institutionalisation of democracy and human rights in the Charter. At the same time, it's not, you could also argue that it's not really the Charter itself that provided a mandate for that, for such initiatives, but rather the Charter represented the outcome of certain member states' desire to see a greater role for ASEAN in promoting democracy and human rights, and that the 5-point consensus is also representative of certain states saying we really have to do something about this situation. So it's a little bit tricky. The other thing is just with news from Thailand the last few days, and we've also had state elections in Malaysia, elections in Cambodia recently. So we're seeing political transitions in the region, which often are not as significant as one might hope. The Charter states that ASEAN will, and its member states shall adhere to principles of rule of law, democracy, good governance, and constitutional government. So by extension, ASEAN should be against unconstitutional changes of government. And of course, but when we see coups occurring and unconstitutional changes of government and regression, retreat from democracy, it's hard to say that the ASEAN Charter is providing a strong basis for ASEAN to coordinate a regional response and put pressure on states to move towards democracy rather than away from it.
Absolutely.
Perhaps it's also a wrong starting point. Why we should start with this charter? ASEAN has started without any charter for the last 20, 25 years, and ASEAN developed from 5 into 10, and then we have a charter just later on. And this is not some kind of Magna Carta or European Union constitution with this take. It's only a couple of pages. So you compare Indo-Pacific, for instance. ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific is barely only 4 pages. If you compare with the German one, the French one, it's always a lot of pages and articles. So this is a modus vivendi. As a community based on modus vivendi, which is of a daily conversation, daily dialogue. Yeah? And after all, if you look objectively, this is not, Myanmar is very serious matters. We have been doing for a long time, but I believe it can be resolved, but takes much, much longer time. But this is not Afghanistan.
Let me stay with Myanmar for the moment, and I'm happy you raised this this arbitrariness in trying to see where is the historical point from which to start, right? However, Avery, you also mentioned the 5-point consensus, and I'm wondering whether we could turn our discussion to this specific situation, if we are talking about democracy and human rights, and to see how, to what extent that 5-point consensus, that 5-point consensus model has in any way been impactful. Would you be able to say something about that? Whether many commentators say it's seen as a failure. Others say, well, this is a very good beginning of something that takes a while, that will not be solved in a very short time. How do you see the impact of the 5-point consensus? And maybe I'll start with Avery.
Oh, okay. Do you want me to use this one? Okay. It's not very encouraging to call it a failure, to say it's failed, but it's also difficult to suggest that it's yet a success. So, and I think what we've seen is that there are divisions among ASEAN members on the best way to approach the situation in Myanmar. There's obviously international pressure. There's sort of expectations that ASEAN will pressure Myanmar or diplomatically encourage Myanmar to come to resolve conflict, to observe, to either hold another election or to go back and observe the results of previous elections, obviously to release Aung San Suu Kyi. But what we've seen, the so-called track 1.5 process begin in March in Thailand with representatives of the junta together with Myanmar's neighbours and other mainland Southeast Asian states. And that group tried to pressure ASEAN to overturn its decision not to allow Myanmar to bring representatives to ASEAN summits and other high-level meetings, unsuccessfully. But what that track 1.5 process has shown is that that there are divisions within the group. We can't assume that because a 5-point consensus was signed, including by the Myanmar junta, that there's a unified approach, because I think there certainly isn't. Whether there needs to be a unified approach to achieve progress on Myanmar is another question. And I think clearly there are those in ASEAN among ASEAN states who say, no, we don't need a unified ASEAN position in order to achieve progress. So I think that it reminds us that coalitions of like-minded states can gather and take different approaches. They don't have to kind of follow this ASEAN line.
Yeah, I don't like that approach because for us, I don't like that approach. We have the experience with JIM, for instance, Jakarta Information for Cambodia. It takes about 20 years to have Cambodia to come into from a scattered country into country that today now is not perfect, but we save Cambodia. And this has been done within ASEAN with a lot of help from international community as well. But the point is that you cannot slice ASEAN apart. Yeah? This is very dangerous. That's why our decision is that we are not going to isolate Myanmar, but still engaging with them. But I know our minister, Retno Marsudi, already have a lot of contacts with all the faction in Myanmar, not only with the regime. And the decision of Myanmar is that no regime is going to be represented in our meeting, but it will be represented by the political, that means the bureaucracy. Now, the approach is that you need to maintain dialogue. We are Mortis Vivendi people, not treaty people. Maintaining dialogue is very important.
Core of ASEAN.
Yeah, the whole ASEAN still intact, just like during the difficulty faced by Cambodia. Yeah, if the like-minded approach working within ASEAN mechanism, that's good. But if the approach like Brexit, for instance, kick them out from ASEAN, this is not good. This is not good because it will be by a rough regime, stray away, And just remember, this is stability about the Indian Ocean, to some extent that we are talking about, because ASEAN is right in the middle of Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean. Myanmar is in the Indian Ocean side, which is very strategic. After that, we are talking about Andaman, Nicobar, we are talking Strait of Malacca, and so on. So keep Myanmar within our dialogue is important rather than excile them. So we know that some Western community is very sensitive, even though they don't want to take the whole ASEAN picture with Myanmar on it. But for us, as far as Myanmar is represented by those we agreed upon, then it's still 10 countries, rather than 10 minus 1. Yeah.
Thomas.
Yeah, I would just add to, similar probably line of thought is, if you look back to the intention of the consensus itself, it was really for ASEAN that they could play a defining role in actually making a difference, to have a dialogue with the junta, and they were clearly not interested in talking. So if you look on the 5 points, they would be very hard to achieve if there was no dialogue, and dialogue broke down pretty quickly.
The failure in that sense was on the side of,
Correct. So I think it was, again, I think almost the symbolism that they came together and agreed on these 5 points and put them forward to the junta, but also the international community. Because I think the other point is that this is not an ASEAN problem, so to speak, which is not what you're saying in your question, but I think it's a broader international community problem for a country that happens to also be a member of ASEAN. So I think the fact that they stood up with these 5 points, I think, was a really important way forward and a constructive way forward. And I think because they haven't reached that yet, means it doesn't have failed, it's work in progress. So I think, again, it's a mechanism for dialogue, and they just need to press on the case. Yeah.
Great. Yes, thank you, Thomas. I have questions for you separately. And I'd like to start with you, Dr. Poole, or Avery, if I may. You have written a book on democracy and rights in Southeast Asia, and legitimacy is a core concept of your book. And you analyze how ASEAN operates on a global scale through legitimacy. There's a clear tension between ASEAN's aspirational language and the way democracy is upheld, the so-called rhetoric action gap. Could you walk us through how you see legitimacy operating for ASEAN? And I think it links up well with what you were talking about earlier, and maybe that bridges the gap between some of the things that the ambassador has proposed.
Okay, thanks, Sonia. So yes, my book was motivated by the puzzle of why ASEAN would adopt these references to democracy and human rights in its rhetoric, and then kind of provide the foundation for the establishment of the human rights body. And the puzzle is because, of course, unlike the European Union, ASEAN does not require its members to be liberal democracies with market economies. The states that become members of ASEAN need to be located in Southeast Asia and to accept the norms and principles of ASEAN and respect those. And we know that there's several member states that are not democratic and don't have particularly good human rights records. So my argument, as you note, was related to legitimacy in arguing that democracy and human rights became standard principles in ASEAN rhetoric, largely because of the work of some key member states, Indonesia in particular, and Philippines and Thailand, and individuals who represented those states in ASEAN who really believed in the importance of democracy and human rights as regional endeavours, and a lot of involvement from civil society groups and active parliamentarians who really wanted to see a role for ASEAN. And some of this was about, I think Thomas referenced before, ASEAN needing to shore up its credibility and relevance in the wake of the Asian financial crisis in particular in the late 90s, but then also some state violence in Myanmar in particular, and that sense of ASEAN needing to really do something in this space. So what I was looking at was, why did the more recalcitrant members agree to this? And the argument was about really external regional legitimacy, the idea, or the ASEAN's sense of itself and what it believed was the image of itself from outside. There was this real concern about external legitimacy and how it believed that sort of credibility and relevance would be shored up. And also in the legitimacy literature, it's about kind of an entity as the appropriate, proper and legitimate representative of the member states. So that was kind of what got it over the line. And I guess there was some hope in this book about, okay, now that these provisions exist, hopefully we know there's lots of civil society groups in particular, but also people, you know, Indonesian Foreign Ministry, a lot of people there, a lot of key people in ASEAN states who really wanted to make those provisions mean something and to make the Intergovernmental Commission mean something. In more recent years, it's hard to be as, I mean, I've had a lot of moments of thinking, well, this whole argument just doesn't really, isn't that great anymore. Paxis, we might say, you know, well, what does the charter mean? We existed for this long without a charter. But it kind of raises core questions about what does ASEAN want to do? What kind of organisation does it want to be in the future? And is it really, sometimes the kind of ASEAN enthusiasts will say, well, we haven't had interstate conflict in the region for all this time. ASEAN, because of its norms because of the emphasis on sovereignty and non-interference and consultation and consensus and the ASEAN way, that kind of keeps a group of diverse states hanging together as you know, with some sort of collective identity. But then those of us, and probably everyone in this room is here because they're interested in Southeast Asia, we know that there are just a multiplicity of identities, you know, within ASEAN countries, within communities, within states, within towns, you know. And so the idea of a collective ASEAN identity, I think, is a really difficult concept, a difficult argument to convincingly make. So this whole argument about, I think there's still a sense of ASEAN being motivated by how it believes it's being seen from the outside and wanting to kind of have relevance and credibility from the outside. But I would argue there should be much more attention to inside ASEAN and what does ASEAN mean for the people who live in ASEAN member states and their everyday lives. And that's, of course, where you get to the kind of nitty-gritty of what does ASEAN mean. There's research that suggests that, you know, a huge number of people in Southeast Asia are either not aware of ASEAN at all, or if they're aware of it, they sort of have some vague idea of what it does, and only a minority who see it as relevant to their everyday lives. So the bigger or more probably important question is about internal legitimacy. Sorry, that was a long answer.
And also the context, the parameters of legitimacy are changing, I'm assuming, also with China becoming such a growing influence. So this was really a great context, Avery, to maybe ask the ambassador the question in relationship to China, because in the past decade we've seen the growing influence of China in Southeast Asia, including ASEAN, and it seems that maybe also in relationship to that internal legitimacy of ASEAN, it seems that ASEAN can play, or is already playing, a substantive role in mediating or channeling diplomatic efforts between the US and China. So are there any signs, or have you witnessed from your capacity that Indonesia, as current chair of ASEAN, can indeed still step into this mediating role, or has done so in the past year? Would you be able to tell us a little bit more about that?
I think before we come to that, I need to raise one issue that mostly is the common fallacy of the West about ASEAN. So if you ask a question, what is ASEAN make up for? Part is the democratic system, other is not. This is ASEAN. We are united by history, but all of us is the victim of the West. The Dutch, the French, the Americans, colonization, yeah? And we are united after the decolonization. So when you are going to see what is the foundation of ASEAN, of course, Bangkok Declaration. And what is Bangkok Declaration 1967 all about? Is to promote economic cooperation among ASEAN and cultural understanding. This is what the Bangkok discussion started off. We are not talking yet about human rights because we're still learning and we're still suffering from the colonization of the American or French or the Indochina War. Yeah, number one. Number two, that unites us is everyone is poor in ASEAN. Yeah, and everyone somehow have connection with the West. And the reverse, used to be colonized, but now become the partners, right? Now, what unites us is actually the common histories and the common interests. The common interest rather than common values is very practical, economic development, right? Now, and look at also the time when ASEAN was born. It's in the heyday, during the heyday of the Cold War. No, people hardly understand because they are part of the Cold War. ASEAN is the victim of the Cold War, right? So again, we are united by the victimization. And that's why if you are talking about why ASEAN is different, there is a communist party still in ASEAN. There is liberal democracy like in Indonesia, even though we're still struggling with that. What united us is actually the common interest of economic development. And from that, we are agreed that partnership is more important than alliances. We see that China is the source of trade with us. We learn from Australia because you are the best friend of China. Why? Because you are in the world, the only country with a surplus of 90 billion US dollar with China is only Australia. So we learn from Australia. Yeah. But if you are talking about investment, all investment coming from America, from United States. So we try to balance trade to go to China and investment coming from United States. So from the very beginning, we are non-aligned. So non-aligned for us is real. That's why we have ZOP Fund, Zone on Peace, Freedom and Neutrality during the heyday of the Cold War. And now the Cold War is coming again. You asked me the question, are we going to mediate China and America things? You can mediate people if they really want to go to peace or to become friends to the others, but they don't. They are actually contending one to the others. Now, but we already have some attempt. East ASEAN Summit is a good place for that. During the G20, our chairmanship, they met in Bali already. Even though Russian leaders not coming, but China leadership and American leadership met in Bali already. Yeah. So at the most, I think, judging from our limitation, but also on the increasing of ASEAN convening powers, the things that we can do is more on the good offices rather than mediation. We understand our limitation. And we understand the nature of relationship in America and China. Yeah.
This is, I think, a good segue to ask Thomas a question. Because we're thinking here, you know, this strategic core values of ASEAN and economic development being a very important goal. You work for the Asia Society Australia, and a core mission of your global nonprofit organization is to foster a deeper understanding of, you know, the more complex Asia, to encourage and cultivate trade relations and economic partnerships. So from your point of view, how does, if we are, you know, talking about our earlier discussion of ASEAN's legitimacy with respect to democracy, human rights, and maybe not, if we go into that direction, how does this legitimacy shape how businesses and investors approach the region?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, you know, Southeast Asia is a very attractive investment destination for not just for Australia, but for most of the world. And it's really changed in the last kind of 10 to 15 years in particular. Here in Australia, that's recognized by big business, by corporate Australia. It's backed by both state and federal governments, by trade agreements and other incentives. Many of you would know there's a new special envoy for Southeast Asia, and they're currently about to launch a new Southeast Asia economic strategy to 2040 by the federal government, which should come out in the next few weeks. So there's a big momentum, and they see there's a big opportunity to obviously to do more. And for very good reason, Southeast Asia and ASEAN, offers real opportunity in terms of trade and economic relations. And certainly they're not starting from scratch. Already, ASEAN as a bloc is Australia's second largest trading partner. So there's a lot of trade and investment already happening, but there's opportunity to do more. So that's that as a context. Diversification as well. China has been mentioned, and we know that for many Australian companies and the Australian economy as a whole, we need to diversify away from China, continue to grow that partnership, but look at other regions close to our borders, and Southeast Asia is very top on that list. And that's part of this economic strategy that is about to come out. So coming to your question, and also to follow up on some of the comments that the ambassador made, when businesses look at Southeast Asia and look at ASEAN, they do obviously recognize that the region is very diverse, that every economy within ASEAN is very diverse and it needs a specific strategy. Some of these countries also have, as we know, very different political systems, which also then requires businesses to do comprehensive, long-term and very tailored entry strategies. They need to have local partners and local knowledge, and they really need to do their due diligence, and that can't be underestimated. And I would say that businesses, and we've done some work on this, businesses and investors who succeed and do really well in any country, including in Southeast Asia and in ASEAN, are those who actually look at markets individually, who do not look at ASEAN as a whole, and then assess a whole range of criteria or preconditions. And to give an example, I'm not going to talk about Indonesia, as the ambassador would know very well and can comment on that. But another example, again, that some work we have done at Asia Society is on Vietnam, which here in Australia has really become a new, but a real new frontier for business investment and trade, and is a very active trade partner with Australian businesses. So if you look at that, what are some of the factors driving development and growth in Vietnam? What is it making an attractive destination for an Australian business? And again, there would be a whole range of preconditions or criteria, and to list a few, obviously strong economic growth and competitiveness, benefits from free trade agreements, that the two governments can help facilitate regional integration. So that's also an important part. How do they engage with the rest of the region in terms of supply chains? Favorable demographics. Many countries in Southeast Asia in particular are quite young. So there's a growing middle class, a growing domestic demand. They also look at things like urbanization, an educated workforce, as well as digital transformation. So in terms of what do you sell and how do you sell it? These are just to mention a few. And again, human rights, democracy also plays into this increasingly, but it's more about, I would say, ongoing domestic reforms, actually making markets open, accessible, and free, and have accountable governments in place who can help facilitate business engagement and help facilitate the trade agreements that needs to be in place to open these doors. There are obviously other countries within ASEAN, if you look beyond Vietnam as an example, where this is not happening. Obviously Malaysia, has been a lot of political turmoil, and we see that big multinational companies actually moving away, or they're overlooking Malaysia as an investment destination because it's too risky. It's a bad investment because they don't know what might happen tomorrow or next week. Another example is obviously Thailand, which has also been talked about. We have a new leader in Thailand, but again, since the 2014 coup, again, there's been a lot of turmoil there. They're still one of the largest economies within the region. But again, many are questioning, is Thailand the right place to continue investing, or are there other countries? And this is not, again, as I said with Myanmar, this is not unique to ASEAN as a region. This is just, common business sense when you look at entering or growing your investment in a particular market, the preconditions around a stable government, which makes investments more secure and less risky, is kind of common sense, including when it comes to ASEAN. And human rights is part of that aspect as well.
Could you say something specifically about Australia here and what kind of challenges Australia faces if they're thinking about investments in the region or in ASEAN?
So I would think, so similar sense with, as I mentioned before, Australia, obviously our biggest trading partner is and continue to be China. And with China, you can't replace, so you often hear people talk about, you can't say China or, it's a China and or a China plus. But I think that doesn't really give justification to the real opportunities elsewhere, including in Southeast Asia. And I think many countries, including Indonesia, including Vietnam, as well as Thailand, where, for instance, you have companies like Blackmores, which is the largest health product provider and have been there for decades. You've got a university sector, of course, as you can look as an export. Again, they look for local partnership. They look for stable conditions. And if they are not there, then they will either move away or they will decide not to enter. Yeah. So it's not an Australian kind of case, but I think what's unique for Australia, and which is also one of the preconditions, is that we have very strong people-to-people links, and we know, I think, our neighbours very well, and I think that's the starting point. You need to have a long-term view. You need to invest in the partnerships and local knowledge. So again, I think those companies that don't do that and look on short-term gains, they are likely not to succeed.
More on the practical point of view, as my job as a diplomat for the last 30 years, actually things already happening. Now, we are not in the compartment. Life is so blurred one to the other beyond border of the compartment. Okay, we are talking about human rights, we are talking about democracy, at least we have compartment. But business actually are good things. Because, okay, Australian standard, you have labor standard, that's human rights, part of democracy as well. You have environmental standard. This is also part of the human rights to have good environment and so on. Look, the large, in Queensland, the largest coal mine in Queensland, Ravenswood, for instance, is 50% Indonesia. Yeah. We have a lot of big companies operate in the mining in Australia, especially now. We are hunting more lithium, rare earth in here, and they establish business in here in Australian standard. What does it mean? That Indonesian company learning, doing, and be successful with the high standard of Australia on human rights of the laborers, on environmental standard. This is a fact of life because we have been successful here. Yeah. Now, the same company then working in Indonesia, working in the in America, within this standard. So actually, it's not only benchmarking, this is learning by doing. Rather than like, okay, you do a lot of things, you lecturing, yeah? But doing things together. So let's say Salim Group, Puma is operating in here, Sinarmas is operating in here, using your standard and successful. So we do the same also in Africa, for instance. No, the point is that learning, doing, and working within higher standard is very important to improve our capacity and also legitimacy in the world as a good company. Mixing the standard of sustainability, the standard of human rights, and democracy, because it's reflected in the business. And we have been doing it in the last 20 years. And that's the role of Australia to open up market for your counterpart in ASEAN.
So it's in the making, right? It's in the process and not only as only as norms that need to be adhered to. That's a really interesting, way of trying to look at it from a different perspective. I want to ask all of you a question about the future, in the sense that you know, we're living in such a fast-paced time, and I was wondering how you foresee ASEAN changing. How do you see it growing over the next few decades? What kind of trends excite you, and what are the trends that worry you? So maybe I'll start with Avery.
So I'll try to keep it briefer than my last answer. In terms of trends that excite me, or maybe if I frame it more as opportunities that could, I think a big one for me is the opportunity and the potential to bring more voices into ASEAN, so into ASEAN dialogue. So we know that there are civil society groups, you know, academics, journalists, parliamentarians, including in opposition, where in countries where opposition parties are allowed to operate, think tanks and so on, people who want more of a say and have a right to have more of a say in what some have termed a kind of participatory regionalism. So ASEAN shouldn't be an elite-centric project. And there's recognition by ASEAN itself. You know, we're trying to move away from being elite-centric, but it's difficult to kind of, you know, to sort of see that happening, especially when the kind of officially approved entities associated with ASEAN are a very short list of kind of highly, you know, so there's a huge opportunity to bring more voices in. And we see on in sort of social media and kind of the internet, obviously there's kind of potential for an alternative way to for more voices to come in. My very good friend, Dr. Aim Sin Peng, who is the Thailand lead here at the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre, is doing really interesting and important work in this space. The role of social media in elections, but also we have to recognise that social media can also be a threat to democracy. You know, it can be used by those who want to garner support for authoritarian figures as much as it can be a voice for those who believe in the importance of democracy. So we need to better understand the role of the digital space and social media. So that's one area that I think is really interesting. It's certainly not my area of expertise, but I want to learn more about it. And then just very quickly, maybe another thing that is exciting or, you know, has potential is Timor-Leste. Potentially, it's been a very long time that we've been talking about it becoming the 11th member of ASEAN. There's finally a roadmap that was agreed in May and as sort of sets out all of these milestones for Timor to establish a diplomatic mission and make sure it has the logistics and the infrastructure to be able to host, you know, literally hundreds and hundreds of ASEAN meetings that a state needs to host when it's acting as chair as ASEAN, which is alphabetically rotating through the members. So accession of Timor-Leste would add another democratic voice. So I think that's an exciting thing. So I'll leave it there. I'll leave it for the others to bring in what worries them,
worries.
because I have worries, but I'll leave it to my fellow panelists.
I would like to see the development more in the positive tone. So, because most of us in ASEAN, we have hope for the future, actually. When ASEAN was founded by the founding fathers, we are not born yet at the time, perhaps, no one thinks among these founders about one day ASEAN become the leading sector for digital transformation like today. 72 million small and medium enterprises united by the IT base. And we never imagined before that Bukalapak then become invested in Australia or Privy in Sydney. But it's happening today. Yeah. So digital transformation. And then energy transition is amazing in ASEAN. You like it or not, China has a very much leading sectors on that. What has been achieved by the world in 50 years, they achieve it in 10 or 15 years, 15, yeah. You can see the quality of life has been improving. Living standard has been improving in most of the ASEAN countries, life expectancy and so on. Because if you look at really on the statistic, a lot of things that has been achieved. on digital things. It's also helping a lot on the connectivity among young people, on the transfer of values, debating on the values and so on. Yeah. And number three is actually more on the how health, after we have all the pandemics, give us the another opening up on the horizon. But this is also part of democracy and also human rights. And we understand, learning from the history of the way we're struggling against the COVID-19, for instance, give us awareness that life matters a lot, actually. And this is just beyond the rhetorics that we're having today, but we need to do things in the ground. And ASEAN has been doing that really, really very good. Yeah. So I have a lot of hope on that.
Yeah. Thomas?
Thank you. Again, if I take from an Australian, I guess, government perspective as well, and to my previous, comment, I think what excites, I think, us here is that if you look on the Albanese government, they've really elevated the relationship and I guess the ASEAN centrality as part of their foreign policy since they took office over a year ago. It's the energy of the engagement have really never been like this since the Keating era, I would say. Penny Wong, she's always on the plane. She's back in the region this week. She's visiting Vietnam and Malaysia. And Albanese is due to go back again soon. And I think the point of differentiation there is that the Australian government and the foreign policy, they're really trying to build ASEAN and Southeast Asia into its intellectual foundation of its policy. So it's much more of a deeper partnership than we've probably seen for a long time. Albanese's first visit as a prime minister, bilateral visit that was, obviously went to Japan for the Quad summit, but as a bilateral visit was Indonesia. Penny Wong has been to all ASEAN states except for Myanmar, and she did that in the first 6 months. So I think there mean, real action behind the intent and the words, and we see that's happening. I think what's worrying, or which is the challenge, that this is again is a broader challenge, is obviously the broader geopolitical fragmentation that is happening between the US and China in particular, but is also playing out in the Indo-Pacific. We also have Russia's continued invasion of Ukraine, and again to quote our foreign minister, talked about a strategic equilibrium, and what the Australian government wants to do, and the role of ASEAN is really to helping the notion of where countries are not forced to choose but can make their own sovereign choices. And I think that also goes back to the origin and the thinking behind ASEAN in the first place, and really building alignment around what's our shared objectives and how we want to shape the region in our own image. Just a final point, obviously, I still think despite its difficulties, ASEAN can really look back on success as a bloc around containing peace in the region. And I think if there was anything that we're going to do going forward is really to continue that work, look at its achievements, but continue to emphasize the rule of law and have open dialogue. I think that's, if you don't have dialogue, not much can happen. Again, we see Australia and China for a few years. You need to have open dialogue for anything to happen. And I think that needs to be the first step, and I think ASEAN is doing that very well. If you look at the business opportunities again, some have forecasted that business opportunities in the region is, for Australia and other countries, is probably as big as Japan and China was 50 years ago. That's a big claim to make, but I think that the foundations are really there. So I think it's a really exciting opportunity ahead for us, and I think Southeast Asia will play an incredibly important role, not just for Australia, but for the global economy. So watch that space, I would say.
It's a fantastic way to end this formal part of the event. And I would love in some questions from audience that the panel members can engage with. So one here already, I'll just give the...
Thank you so much. And yeah, my name is Nin, and I'm from Myanmar. I'm studying here in University of Sydney, and thank you for somehow very interested to hear about all the ASEAN crisis and legitimacy issue in in ASEAN. So I would like to ask the questions that for the five-point consensus, it's about, as my understanding, is more about diplomatic strategy way to tackle with Myanmar issue. But I think Hunter is more about the military leader is more about the military stance, and they are more in it. Their way of thinking and their way of doing is more on the military approach. So, and also they never care about that cutting off connection with Myanmar, close the country and cutting off with the international community and so on. That they have been doing, obviously, like they never accept any diplomat to visit to Myanmar, right? So, do you think that such, I'm so excited on that, so sorry, I just arrived here 6 months ago, so I'm still unable to manage my emotions, sorry. So do you think that such diplomatic approach, like ASEAN consensus, are facing toward the opposite direction that Hunter are doing? And do you think that such diplomatic way will be able to achieve that what's really happening in Myanmar and probably any other ASEAN in such human rights issue? Yeah.
Yeah, I just come back from Vanuatu, not as diplomat, but we renovate the airport. So, yeah. So the point is this: Myanmar experience, Vietnamese experience during Indochina War, or Indonesian experience in 1965 and others reform. Actually, the responsibility lies in the nation concerned. Yeah, the others can help you, but you need to strive more. This is what we experience. We have been under authoritarian regime for a long time, yeah. But somehow we manage to have a reform in the peaceful context, the fall of Suharto, yeah. So I believe that sharing experience at longer time, but what we experience in Indonesia is real. Part of my life, I still remember, was during the Suharto regime, and I still remember how me, myself, and people goes to the parliament during the fall of Suharto, and then we transformed into democracy without too much victims and violence. Yeah. So if Indonesia can do that, if Cambodia also can do that during the Jakarta informal meetings, yeah, I believe you can also do. But the responsibility is with Myanmaris. The other is going to help you. Yeah, to move in the ground is you. Yeah, learning from the experience of Indonesia and other countries in the region. I think this is why it takes longer times, but I still see, because Utan is from Myanmar. You are the leader of the world once before, right? So don't lose hope. Yeah. Everyone is going to help you, but you need to do a lot in the ground. Yeah. Thank you.
So I've got a question here and there, yes.
Okay. I'm Elizabeth Beog from the International Commission of Jurists, and I thank the panel for their free, open and frank discussion of human rights in ASEAN. Now, it's wonderful to see that these words are now part of the discourse in ASEAN, and one thing I would acknowledge with ASEAN dialogues and statements is the wonderful work they've done on migrant workers in the region, which has really been great. But there is an almost taboo topic that is not discussed by ASEAN and yet is a problem in the region, and that's asylum seekers and refugees. Now, every single ASEAN state has a refugee problem. Some have a huge one, such as Thailand, such as Malaysia, and we've seen over the last 2 years that that problem has exacerbated, and yet the response to refugees is getting harder. The Achinese fishermen who rescue the Rohingya have their boats burned. Rohingya children in Malaysia are still subject to detention. I mean, these conditions and rights for refugees are not acknowledged at all across ASEAN. And it seems, looking at ASEAN discourse, it's a topic that's not raised at all. And one of the things that concerns me as somebody who goes and talks about refugee rights across the region is that there's no international engagement there. Not one single ASEAN state has an official agreement with the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. In those countries where they have an office, it's by agreement, by sort of a wink and a nod, but it's not official and concrete. And every NGO that works with refugees in the region is, well, we can't say that because maybe we'll get kicked out. And that's part of the organisation that I work with too. I'd just like to ask you, given that this is a problem that's not going away, we all know, as we've talked here, Myanmar's not going away and the refugees will continue. Something that I work very closely on in Australia and in the region are Afghan refugees. That's not going to go away either, and nor the increasing numbers from China. When will ASEAN, and what will it take for ASEAN to see this as a topic that they have to think about as a group or even as individual countries?
Really very clear and great question. And I really appreciated how you started with, you know, a very important thing that ASEAN was able to do. The work in the space of trafficking was very important and they were very successful. So the question is really, can this happen in the space of asylum, refugeehood? Can this similar thing that was so successful with trafficking happen in the space of the asylum question? And also just to note, I'm sorry, I know I should be only the chair, but this is of course something different from the Indonesian context in terms of the spillover effects that the situation in Myanmar has on, you know, refugees coming into Malaysia, Thailand, etc. Yeah. So shall I start with Thomas, maybe?
Well, I was given the microphone. I'm certainly no expert, and it's. Thank you for the question. It's a very difficult issue, and it's a very difficult question. And I'm not going to attempt to give you the answer, but I guess, and again, I will come back to an earlier comment I made. This is not this is a problem where ASEAN as a association can come together. It's a bigger issue. It's where, again, the international community needs to come together. The UN agencies need to really work with local governments at a whole range of levels. And we also see we've had similar issues in other, I guess, regional blocks, if you like, including if you look at EU as still an experiment, you would say, we're still facing a lot of issues. And now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, again, they're facing new migration, refugees that they haven't had for probably since the Yugoslavian war. So I think this is again a really complex issue, but I think with Southeast Asia, again, I think because of its geography and because of its ethnic cultural differences within. I think that makes the issue even more complex. So I think the answer would be that it needs to be, I think this issue needs to be addressed at the highest international level. The UN would need to play a very active role, but then together, to bring in ASEAN where they can leverage together with local governments. So it's a multi-international coordinated effort that needs to take place. And again, you have to go deep into each individual case and location, which you would know better than anyone in this room, to address, the tragedy that individuals are facing and continue to face. So I don't know how they're going to make this happen and come up with a practical solution in the short term. But I think, again, to me, it's an international problem that can't be left to ASEAN or any individual country, because it is obviously a cross-border issue, and we need to take lessons where we can from other cases or situations elsewhere. So that would just be my observations. To me, it's an international humanitarian crisis, and it needs an international humanitarian crisis response.
I think we need to be fair on that. Yeah, normally the intake is very slow. The influx is very high. And the difference between intakes by the advanced country and the influx of the refugee in the developing countries, we need some more fairness in here. But the job is how to push more intakes and speed up the process, right? No, but from the data from the yeah, the World Economic Forum, for instance, the largest will be inside and in Syria is 6.5 million. Yeah, Turkey is about 3.6, mostly in the border. So you cannot compare this with ASEAN. We have a lot, but it's not like the one in the Middle East. But the point is that most of the country who host the refugee are very either poor or developing countries. Yeah. So, but at least we have Bali process already. Yeah. Last year we celebrated the anniversary in Adelaide. Yeah. But the point is that how to speed up the intakes. Yeah. Because you cannot just leave everything in developing countries whether or not they are part of the refugee convention. Yeah, because this is real life. I know that a lot of refugees from Myanmar in the coast of Aceh until now. And this is a fact of life. You cannot just ignore them. They came and they mingled in the communities, yeah, and they survived there. And the processing by UN is always very slow. Yeah, and that's the reality we got to face.
Yes, we've got a question.
Thank you. My name is Minh Le, and I'm from Vietnam. I graduated here at this university in 1994. Yeah, one topic that I'm fascinated, and it hasn't been mentioned here, is South China Sea and the attempt of militarization on various islands in that sea. The question is actually for the ambassador. I think this is the test for the central role of ASEAN on the whole, and it's the test for how effective ASEAN can become in surviving between China and the United States and other powers. So can you see any new development, progress in this kind of negotiation in South China Sea? And given even very recently, there was an attempt by the Philippines to provide provisions to some islands and got blocked by Chinese vessels. Are you aware of that? And can you share any insight about how ASEAN move along and help solve those issues? Thank you.
Yeah, the progress is very slow. We got to admit that. It's very complex situation. The 9-dash line actually from Kuomintang parties, from Taiwan, yeah. But now the both claim are the same. So you can see from historical perspective, it's also very complicated. Every country has a claimant, except Indonesia, we are non-claimant. But then the others is a claimant. So the first, when we got into TOC, Declaration of Conduct, is a big step. But when we move to the COC, it's a bit difficult. And until now, the progress is very slow. But the point is, Jojo is always better than war from Churchill's. Yeah. So as far as we negotiate, as far as we maintain the dialogue, it's still a better situation than the dialogue is stopped. Remember Parasail incident, the war of the Parasail between Vietnam and China and the ICTs, yeah, which claimed 60 lives of the sailor and so on. That level, conflict at that level is absent today. But the point is that more on the how many others things come into influence to influence the region. So if you compare the satellite photograph every 10 years. You can have it in the internet and the NASA website. The region of the South China Sea is not getting darker, it's getting brighter. There's more investment, more industrial park, especially in Vietnam. I went to industrial park in Vietnam in the vicinity of the South China Sea. Then the question why company believe to invest 99 years rent or land like in Vietnam, mostly in the vicinity of South China Sea. Vietnam coast in the South China Sea, and then Indonesian coast in the South China Sea, Batam, Karimun, and then Sabah and Sarawak in the South China Sea up to the Manila Bay. Now it's full of the industrial complex, yeah, full with especially Vietnam. So people still have a lot of hope that investment is good in the region, and the liberal theories that the more we engage economically, there might be a more chance to have more dialogue. So dialogue in terms of the legal solution will be very difficult. Political solution is also difficult. But now the business has been working a lot in the region to make more interconnectedness of interest. And I think this is a good thing that we need to capitalize as well.
So do you think economics will trump the geopolitical tensions eventually? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, this is what, but because this part of the theories on when we start with the international relation, where we have liberal, neoliberalisms, and realism, this is part of that theory actually. When we see the physically, that more and more people invest in the region. And the way of Toyota, Innova, for instance, Toyota investing in the region because of the connectivity around the South China Sea developed by ASEAN. ASEAN Master Plan of Connectivity. That's why most of the engine is developed mostly in Thailand, rubber part in the Philippines, and electric part is in Manila Bay. Assembling in Indonesia, and you have very competitive Toyota across the South China Sea. This is factors that need to be into account. Like my story about why we invest in Australia, to learn more on the standardization. Now, that's also one of the things that need to be capitalized on building peace in the South China Sea as well. Yeah.
Thomas or Avery, would you like to add anything? No? Okay.
Thank you so much. I just briefly introduce myself. My name is Katania Han Xingyue from China. Sorry, my current base is Sydney, Australia. And my broader question is about Global South, because ASEAN countries are just a part of Global South. And recently, Modi government from India just made a huge announcement. India is going to stand for the entire Global South. So from your perspective, how are you going to view the political and economic roles ASEAN countries will play in the next few decades? So that's my basic question, because China, as one of the great economies in this world, will surpass American economy by 2036, as per lots of economic statistics, and followed by India. So I think ASEAN will be a rising power in the entire world. And how are you going to change your current political and economic roles by lots of finance and financial instruments, such as RCEP and CPTPP? Thank you so much.
Okay, maybe Thomas, start with you.
So the question was, the rise of the Chinese and the Indian economy versus Southeast Asia or ASEAN?
And whether are equipped because of their, they're seen still as Global South countries.
Yeah. Well,
that's the question, of course, I think, right?
So I would say, maybe put it this way. So there's a lot of, so we talk about trade between, say, ASEAN or Southeast Asia and other parts of the world, which is benefiting Southeast Asia's economic future. I think what we saw, for instance, during COVID, where people couldn't travel, was what actually increased was interregional trade increased. So there's a lot more trade now happening between Southeast Asia. There's also more trade happening between China and Southeast Asia and South Asia for that matter. So within, I guess, the subcontinents of the regions of ASEAN as a whole, there's much more trade within than than ever has been, which was also impacting, I guess, Europe, the US, UK, Australia, and maybe more traditional ways of looking at the region. So I think obviously China has still a very large market globally, but that's also changing. The made in China is changing. There's a lot more bigger companies setting up headquarters in, say, Southeast Asia, and even companies that are founded and also taking on the global stage from Southeast Asia. There's much more examples of those as well. So I think that's why, to the point of why Australia and many other parts of the world are really looking intensively, even European countries like Germany, like France, like the UK, they have very specific strategies for Southeast Asia as well as individual countries within, because that's where they see growth, because again, the preconditions are really strong. So I think, maybe a long way to say that, I think Southeast Asia will play a very strong role. They will continue to develop. They're on a very upwards trajectory. And also if you look at countries like India, India has immense internal challenges. Again, a highly diverse country where there's a lot of displacement, there's a lot of, again, economic hardship. They're also battling problems around climate change and again, division politically. So I think for them as well, that is also stopping them to probably realize, we talk about the realization of the potential of India, that's still to be realized in many respects because of internal issues. So I think for all of those reasons, I think Southeast Asia will really continue to grow, and other parts of, in traditional global players will feel that.
So thank you for your question. I was in Singapore the week before last, and I think Singaporeans would probably object to being categorised in the global south. But Singapore is obviously a particular case. But part of it's in my head because I was just there, but the other reason why I bring it up is because one of the things I'm interested in is this idea of models of growth, and the question that you raise is about what path to economic growth, prosperity, and the question I think that the ambassador has touched on about this idea of whether economic growth and business investment leads to rights, to better political and civil rights. I guess I feel like we've spent a lot of time on sort of economic and social rights and the right to make a living, those sorts of rights. But I think in the region we need to be cognizant of restrictions on civil and political rights. And Singapore is interesting because it's a model of a system where people have effectively traded freedoms for prosperity. And there's, sometimes Singapore is described as kind of benevolent authoritarian system or a soft authoritarian system. The civil and political rights in Singapore are, less kind of blatant, or you don't have kind of examples of state violence on the streets. You're not going to be shot on the streets for expressing your views, but things can be made very, very difficult for you. And there's obviously restrictions on media, dominant party rule. But if you talk to a lot of Singaporeans, there's a huge mix of views, and some young Singaporeans are really pushing for civil and political rights. Others will say, well, the system works. We have safety, we have prosperity. The political model has worked. So I'm interested in, the idea of other countries in the region. Do they look to Singapore and say, well, it's, civil and political rights they can come later. Let's focus on business investment. Let's focus on reducing poverty. And those of us who believe in liberal democracy will say, well, there still needs to be, people need to be able to express their views, to be able to be critical of the government if they believe that criticism or critique is necessary. without the fear of, libel suits, which is a criminal offence in Singapore, not just a civil offence. So there are some really interesting young bloggers in Singapore who write about, migrant rights. We talked about migrant workers before. There's still no minimum wage in Singapore. Who talk about the really significant inequality, I think, in Singapore of wealthy and sort of an underclass of people who struggle to get by. If you're too critical of the government, there are plenty of laws, the fake news law, POTMA, I think the acronym is, and ways that your freedom of speech is restricted through revoking licences, through libel lawsuits and so forth. So I guess this is kind of getting away from your question a little bit, but I think what I'm interested in is there's a lot of stuff in the press recently about whether there's a trend of authoritarian, movement towards authoritarian. I don't know where the word trend means there has to be causation, or can a trend just be correlation? I don't know whether there's lessons or learnings, between states in that way. I think there's far too much complexity within each ASEAN member state for there to be necessarily this idea of looking to other states for models of political rule. But I guess, I don't know what I'm starting to, I need to stop because I'm not quite sure what I'm getting at. But I guess I want to bring political and civil rights back into the conversation when we're talking about models of economic growth. Thanks.
Ambassador?
Thank you. In year 20, the year 2000, 20 years ago, if you look at the G20, we have a global south. It's the portion of the GDP purchasing power parity of the global south is more or less about 22%. And then 30% is North America, the other 30% is European Union. When Indonesia chaired the G20 in 2022, the portion of the global south economy in the G20 already 45%. 45%. I calculate one by one, actually, how much the GDP purchasing power parity. And America shrinks, European Union shrinks into mostly 23, 24, but 45%. 10 years, 2030s will be about 52, 53% is from global south. But it doesn't mean that things just go very simplistic like that. If we are talking about the industry, we are talking about factor of production. This can be land, it can be technology, and capital, and so on. Now, how much we spend for research and development in the global south? Almost nothing. So our technologies much depend still on European Union and North America. So when comes the question whether the global south become a political entity asking for a new rule of the game, I don't think so. Because the more you develop yourself, the more you depend on others. We are talking about the global value chain here. So for us, ASEAN, for instance, that's why partnership is very important. We have a special partnership with the European Union, with America, with all our dialogue partners. This is a must. Now, within Global South, we have a very straightforward demographic development. China is aging now. Especially the eastern part of China, when Shenzhen, others, all the industrial part of China is aging. One-child policy being imposed in the past now become lifestyle. You have more babies. You cannot instruct people to have more babies because the lifestyle already. In Indonesia, perhaps. In Australia, it's already aging community as well. Now, only perhaps India or part of ASEAN, Indonesia, the Philippines, we are still have demographic bonus. But this can be overcome. That's why we have mutual recognition agreement of engineer with Australia, soon with a nurse. Actually, we can supply more people and you become young again. Yeah, so Europe can be young again, Australia become young again. So actually, let's do things together. You become younger and become richer. And we become richer. We can do that. This is the so-called economic powerhouse. So I don't really believe that on the division between Global South and the North. Because if we are talking about global economics, development, value chains, we are one. Still very much one, yeah.
Great, we're out of time. I know that there are a few questions still happening, wanting to be expressed here, but we do have some lovely food and some drinks, and please stay on to mingle still with the panel members. But please join me in thanking them for their insightful contribution to the complexity of ASEAN. And thank you for coming.